During World War II, the rapid expansion of Japanese forces across Asia and the Pacific was marked by widespread violence and atrocities. The narrative of war often focuses on the clash of armies, the strategy of generals, and the resilience of nations. Yet, hidden in the shadows of these grand stories are the countless personal tragedies that unfolded in the wake of invasion. Among the most horrific acts were those committed against women, including systematic sexual assaults. In places like the Netherlands East Indies, even white women, once shielded by the privileges of colonial society, were not spared from the unspeakable brutality. Their stories, often relegated to the footnotes of history, reveal the true cost of war, a cost measured not only in the destruction of nations, but in the profound and enduring trauma of those who suffered in silence.
Let's unveil the secrets of time.
The horrors of Nanking, a fate worse than death. When Japan launched its undeclared war against China in 1937, the world quickly became aware of the Japanese soldiers' penchant for sexual violence. Mass sexual assaults and murder were inflicted on Chinese populations in cities and villages, with foreign journalists reporting on the atrocities, especially in the ravaged city of Nanking. The 170-mile stretch between Shanghai and Nanjing was turned into a nightmarish zone of death and destruction. Japanese planes often strafed unarmed farmers and refugees for fun. Civilians endured extreme violence and brutality, foreshadowing the impending massacre. In one instance, the village of Nanking was set ablaze, with many residents trapped inside their burning homes. 2 women, one of whom was pregnant, were repeatedly assaulted by soldiers. Afterward, the soldiers committed an appalling act, causing fatal harm to the pregnant woman and her unborn child. A young boy, only 2 years old, was forcibly taken from his mother and tragically thrown into a fire, while the mother and other villagers were subjected to violent attacks and left in a creek. Additionally, Jiading was bombarded by Japanese forces, resulting in the indiscriminate killing of 8,000 civilians. Half of Taikang was reduced to rubble, with its salt and grain stores looted. Many Chinese civilians chose to take their own lives, including 2 girls who intentionally drowned themselves near Pinghu, an event observed by Japanese First Lieutenant Nishizawa Benkichi.
We'd take all the men behind the houses and end their lives using bayonets and knives. Then we'd lock up the women in a single house and assault them at night. Then, before we left the next morning, we'd end it all with everybody in the houses. And to top it off, we'd set fire to the houses so that even if anyone came back, they wouldn't have a place to live.
Beginning on December 13, 1937, the Japanese army committed widespread atrocities, including random killings, torture, wartime assault, looting, arson, and other war crimes. These crimes persisted for a period ranging from 3 to 6 weeks, with the most intense violence occurring during the first 3 weeks. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East estimated that during the first month of the occupation, Japanese soldiers committed approximately 20,000 sexual assaults in the city. Some estimates suggest the number could be as high as 80,000. The tribunal reported that sexual assaults were widespread, affecting women of all ages, including children and the elderly, with many instances involving sadistic and violent behavior. Many of the women were murdered and faced humiliation after their death. These atrocities were often carried out systematically, with Japanese soldiers going door to door in search of girls, leading to numerous cases of women being captured and gang assaulted. Japanese soldier Takokoro Kozo recalled,
"Women suffered most. No matter how young or old, they all could not escape the fate of being raped. We sent out coal trucks to the city streets and villages to seize a lot of women, and then each of them was allocated to 15 to 20 soldiers for sexual intercourse and abuse. After the deed, we would also end their lives, since dead bodies don't talk."
After being assaulted, many women were tragically killed, often through brutal and violent means. For instance, a pregnant woman lost her life, along with her unborn child, after being brutally attacked. In another case, a beer bottle was used to assault a young woman, after which she was fatally shot. Edgar Snow described how discards were often bayoneted by intoxicated Japanese soldiers. On 19 December 1937, the Reverend James M. McCallum wrote in his diary,
"I know not where to end. Never I have heard or read such brutality. Rape, rape, rape. We estimate at least 1,000 cases a night and many by day. In case of resistance or anything that seems like disapproval, there is a bayonet stab or a bullet. People are hysterical. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon, and evening. The whole Japanese army seems to be free to go and come as it pleases, and to do whatever it pleases."
A 15-year-old girl was locked naked in a barracks housing 200 to 300 Japanese soldiers and sexually assaulted multiple times daily. American correspondent Edgar Snow wrote how, frequently mothers had to watch their babies taken away from them, or worse, and then submit to assault. On March 7, 1938, Robert O. Wilson, a surgeon at the University Hospital in the safety zone administrated by the United States, wrote in a letter to his family,
"The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling of cases of sexual assault and brutality almost beyond belief. 2 bayoneted corpses are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers came in without warning or reason and killed 5 of their number and wounded the 2 that found their way to the hospital. Let me recount some instances occurring in the last 2 days. Last night, the house of one of the Chinese staff members of the university was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were assaulted. 2 girls, about 16, were assaulted to death in one of the refugee camps. In the university middle school, where there are 8,000 people, the Japanese came in 10 times last night, over the wall, stole food, clothing, and assaulted until they were satisfied. One little boy of 8 who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one on his stomach. I think he will live."
In his diary kept during the aggression against the city and its occupation by the Imperial Japanese Army, the leader of the safety zone, John Rabe, wrote many comments about Japanese atrocities.
2 Japanese soldiers have climbed over the garden wall and are about to break into our house. When I appear, they give the excuse that they saw 2 Chinese soldiers climb over the wall. When I show them my party badge, they return the same way. In one of the houses in the narrow street behind my garden wall, a woman was raped and then wounded in the neck with a bayonet. I managed to get an ambulance so we can take her to Kulu Hospital. Last night, up to 1,000 women and girls are said to have been raped, about 100 girls at Ginling College alone. You hear nothing but rape. If husbands or brothers intervene, they're shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality and bestiality of the Japanese soldiers. I've written several times in this diary about the body of the Chinese soldier who was shot while tied to his bamboo bed, and who is still lying unburied near my house. My protests and pleas to the Japanese embassy, finally to get this corpse buried, or give me permission to bury it, have thus far been fruitless. The body is still lying in the same spot as before, except that the ropes have been cut, and the bamboo bed is now lying about 2 yards away. I am totally puzzled by the conduct of the Japanese in this matter. On the one hand, they want to be recognized and treated as a great power on a par with European powers. On the other, they are currently displaying a crudity, brutality, and bestiality that bears no comparison except with the hordes of Genghis Khan. I have stopped trying to get the poor devil buried, but I hereby record that he, though very dead, still lies above the earth.
In the documentary film In the Name of the Emperor about the Nanking massacre, former Japanese soldier Shiro Azuma openly discussed the acts of sexual assault and murder that took place in Nanking.
At first we used some kinky words like pikankan. Pi means hip, kankan means look. Pikankan means let's see a woman open up her legs. Chinese women didn't wear underpants. Instead, they wore trousers tied with a string. There was no belt. As we pulled the string, the buttocks were exposed. We pikankan. We looked. After a while, we would say something like, "It's my day to take a bath," and we took turns assaulting them. It would have been bad enough if the victims were only assaulted, but unfortunately, after that, they were silenced permanently, as those who are no longer alive cannot speak.
Iris Chang, author of The Rape of Nanking, provided one of the most detailed accounts of Japanese war crimes in China. In her book, she estimated that between 20,000 and 80,000 Chinese women were sexually assaulted by Japanese soldiers. Chang also noted that not all victims were women. Some Chinese men were subjected to sexual assault and forced to engage in repulsive sexual acts. Additionally, there are reports of Japanese troops coercing families into committing incestuous acts. Pregnant women were specifically targeted during these tragic events, with their pregnancies often being violently attacked. Tang Junshan, a survivor and witness of one of the Japanese Army's systematic mass killings, provided testimony regarding these atrocities.
The seventh and last person in the first row was a pregnant woman. The soldier, with malicious intent, separated her from the group and took her to a spot about 10 meters away. When she resisted his advances, the situation escalated, and tragically, he harmed her.
Navy veteran Shomitani reported that the army used a trumpet signal to indicate the order to kill all Chinese who flee. Thousands of individuals were then taken to a mass execution site known as the 10,000 Quartz Ditch, a trench approximately 300 meters long and 5 meters wide. Due to the lack of official records, estimates of the number of victims buried in the ditch vary between 4,000 and 20,000. Stolen lives, the gut-wrenching abuse of comfort women. Despite the horrors of Nanking, the Western powers largely dismissed the evidence, perhaps because it was Asians making war upon Asians. Consequently, it came as a shocking and deeply unpleasant surprise when Japanese troops began raping and assaulting white women with the same brutality they had shown towards the Chinese. Such experiences in China, often sanctioned by commanding officers, led to the deployment of an army across Asia on December 7, 1941, consisting largely of young men whose sense of morality had been deeply perverted. For many, sexual assault had become a normalized aspect of soldiering, akin to beheading prisoners of war or committing self-harm to avoid the disgrace of capture. The treatment of women in the occupied territories by Japanese soldiers was deplorable, driven by a mindset that regarded women primarily as a source of entertainment for soldiers. Whether through coercion or consent, both were deemed acceptable means to obtain sexual contact. The training and battlefield experiences of many Japanese soldiers had distorted their morality, compounded by a strict adherence to orders and a strong desire to conform to the group, a cultural imperative in many Asian societies. Japanese soldiers accessed sex in two main ways: through sexual assault, which often became a group activity encouraged by senior officers, and through visits to women providing adult services, euphemistically referred to as comfort women. These women, attached to Japanese divisions in the field, were regularly replenished. However, most of these so-called comfort women were not adult entertainers in the traditional sense, but rather slaves. Young women forced to submit to the Japanese under threat of death. Estimates of the number of women involved range from 50,000 to 200,000, with historians still researching and debating the exact figures. Initially, the brothels were established to provide soldiers with a controlled sexual outlet, aiming to reduce wartime sexual assaults and the spread of venereal diseases. However, the comfort stations had the opposite effect, leading to an increase in both assaults and the spread of venereal diseases. The first victims were Japanese women, some of whom were recruited through conventional means, while others were deceived or kidnapped. As the number of Japanese volunteers dwindled, the military began targeting women from Japan's colonies, partly to protect Japan's image. Many women were lured by false job offers for positions as nurses or factory workers, while others were enticed with promises of education and financial support. A significant portion of these women were minors. The organized procurement and exploitation of women into comfort battalions is one of the most disturbing aspects of the war in Asia. While soldiers sexually assaulting women in captured towns and villages could be viewed as a brutal consequence of war or fueled by racial hatred, the systematic enslavement of hundreds of thousands of young women over many years within a highly organized framework of sexual exploitation reveals a profound institutional disrespect for women within the Japanese armed forces. Even the term comfort women was derogatory and dismissive. These women came from various nationalities and were drawn into this system of sexual slavery through different means. For over 7 decades in the 21st century, the harrowing realities faced by civilians in some internment camps have largely been suppressed. This silence stems both from the extreme violence inflicted and the profound shame experienced by the innocent victims. The treatment endured by these women was so appalling that many chose never to speak of their traumatic experiences at the hands of the Japanese, not even to their families, war crimes investigators, or later historians. The Japanese military police, known as the Kempeitai, played a central role in propagating this human misery. The Kempeitai, a powerful gendarmerie present throughout the occupied territories, was responsible for rooting out anti-Japanese elements, arresting and torturing suspected spies and saboteurs, administering POW and internment camps, and engaging in organized criminal activities. Among its many responsibilities, the Kempeitai was tasked with procuring women, euphemistically termed comfort women, for Japanese soldiers, establishing and managing brothels in the occupied territories, and controlling the unfortunate women imprisoned within them. Between 1941 and 1945, anywhere from 60,000 to 200,000 young women of various nationalities, creeds, and colors were forced into sexual slavery in military brothels by the Kempeitai. Most of these women were of Asian origin, hailing from Korea, China, and other occupied nations. Initially, some women were recruited with promises of attractive wages for real adult services, but as time went on, women who had never been involved in providing sexual services were deceived or forcibly conscripted, with some even being kidnapped or sold by their families for this purpose. Resistance was futile, as the Kempeitai employed brutal methods to deal with any opposition. The concept of attaching women to military units for the soldiers' sexual gratification is abhorrent to Western armies. However, there is a significant cultural difference in how Japan and Western nations viewed the exchange of sexual services. Japanese soldiers who engaged in sexual assault and abuse, often using military brothels, came from a society where the transactional nature of sexual services was well organized and openly practiced. Across Asia, this practice was an integral part of daily life in cities, a reality still evident in places like Bangkok, Shanghai, and Tokyo today. In Japan, a vast industry catered to men's sexual desires, and the exchange of such services carried little of the stigma associated with the sin-based Christian morality of Western nations. In the Far East, sexual contact, whether marital or extramarital, was seen as natural and something to be enjoyed, with paying for sexual services considered socially acceptable. The Japanese military believed that organized sexual services would benefit their soldiers, especially after the initial terrorization of civilian populations subsided and the occupation began. Providing individuals for these services was thought to improve morale and military effectiveness, and creating military brothels was seen as a way to control sexually transmitted diseases, thereby maintaining soldiers' health. This idea was not new. The British had organized military brothels for soldiers in India during the 19th century with similar intentions. However, the Japanese approach differed significantly in how they recruited women. The Japanese army was well aware of the problems caused by their soldiers' widespread sexual assault and pillaging during initial invasions. The Kempeitai believed that comfort stations, military brothels, would prevent further civilian rapes and reduce hostility in occupied areas, a primary concern since their mission included rooting out anti-Japanese sentiment. However, the establishment of comfort stations did not eliminate casual sexual brutality. Japanese soldiers continued to sexually assault and devastate women throughout the war, both on the front lines and in occupied territories. This behavior was rooted in a belief in their racial superiority and the perceived worthlessness of their victims. In 2007, Japanese veteran Anji Kaneko recalled,
"It didn't matter to us whether women lived or died. We were the emperor soldiers. Whether in military brothels or in the villages, we raped without reluctance."
Initially, the Japanese tried to recruit professional workers for these sexual services to support their armies by placing advertisements in newspapers in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Manchukuo. However, these sources quickly dried up, leading to a shortage of workers, particularly in Japan. The army then resorted to more direct and violent methods to fill its brothels, with the Kempeitai using intimidation and violence to force native women into sexual slavery. It is estimated that many survivors became infertile due to repeated assaults or sexually transmitted diseases contracted from these assaults. Women and girls were dehumanized and stripped of their dignity, being referred to as female ammunition, public toilets, or military supplies. Some were even forced to donate blood to treat injured Japanese soldiers. Despite each victim's unique experiences, they shared common themes of severe physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. They were routinely beaten and compelled to provide sexual services to multiple men, with numbers ranging from 10 on regular days to up to 40 on days following combat. Basic necessities like food, water, proper housing, toilets and washing facilities were not provided, and medical care was limited to treating sexually transmitted diseases, sterilization, and abortion. Women who tried to escape or refused to comply with demands faced torture, and their families were threatened if they attempted to end their lives. As comfort women were forced to accompany the Japanese Imperial Army to battlefields, many died as Allied forces advanced and overwhelmed Japan's defenses. In some instances, Korean comfort women were executed by the Japanese military when they tried to flee losing battles. During the final stages of the war in 1944 to 45, comfort women were frequently forced to end their lives or were killed. For example, at Chuk Lagoon, 70 comfort women were killed before an anticipated American assault, as the Japanese Navy mistook an American air raid for the beginning of a landing. At the Battle of Saipan, comfort women were among those who jumped off cliffs. In Burma, there were reports of Korean comfort women committing self-harm by ingesting cyanide pills or being killed by hand grenades. During the Battle of Manila, while Japanese sailors killed indiscriminately, there does not appear to have been a systematic policy targeting comfort women. The Japanese government had spread false information that Americans were cannibals, leading some Japanese and comfort women to prefer suicide rather than capture. British soldiers in Burma reported that Korean comfort women were shocked to find that the British were not cannibals. Ironically, there were instances where starving Japanese troops on isolated Pacific islands or in the jungles of Burma resorted to cannibalism, and some comfort women were killed to provide food for the Imperial Japanese Army. According to a survivor's account, she was beaten when she tried to resist being sexually assaulted. Women who were not engaged in sexual services before being forced into the Comfort Women Corps, especially those who were coerced, were typically subjected to sexual assault as a means of breaking them in. Kim Hak-sun, a Korean woman, recounted in a 1991 interview how she was drafted into the Comfort Women Corps in 1941.
At 17, Japanese soldiers arrived in a truck, beat my friend and me, and dragged us inside. They promised that if I joined, I could earn a lot of money in a textile factory. On my first day, I was assaulted, and the assaults continued relentlessly. Although I was born a woman, I never truly lived as one. I feel disgusted at the sight of any man, including my own husband who rescued me from the brothel. The sight of a Japanese flag makes me shiver. I refuse to feel ashamed. I have nothing to be ashamed of.
Kim reported being raped 30 to 40 times a day, every day, during her time as a comfort woman. Reflecting their dehumanized status, Army and Navy records referred to the movement of comfort women using the term units of war supplies. In the Philippines, according to the recounts of Filipino survivors Narcisa Claveria, who was enslaved for 18 months at the age of 13. During the day, the women were forced to cook, clean, and do laundry. At night, the Japanese soldiers sexually assaulted and abused the women. The story of the comfort women doing household chores during the day and being sexually abused at night was also recounted by another Filipino survivor, Fidencia David, who was kidnapped by Japanese soldiers at age 14, who also remembered being forced to wash clothes and cook for the Japanese soldiers. At night, David was assaulted by as many as 5 to 10 Japanese soldiers. Along with being sexually assaulted multiple times a day, the women were subjected to separation from their families, often watching their families being murdered by Japanese soldiers. Military doctors and medical personnel often sexually assaulted the women during medical examinations. Dr. Aso Tetsuo, a Japanese army doctor, testified that comfort women were regarded as female ammunition and public toilets, essentially dehumanized and used for abuse. Some comfort women were even forced to donate blood for the treatment of injured soldiers. Of the comfort women, at least 80% were Korean and were assigned to lower ranks, while Japanese and European women were assigned to officers. For instance, Dutch women captured in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, were reserved exclusively for officers. In Confucian Korea, where premarital sexual relationships were strongly condemned, the Korean teenagers conscripted as comfort women were almost always virgins, a practice believed to minimize the spread of sexually transmitted diseases that could incapacitate soldiers and sailors. Cry of fear, the sexual enslavement of white women. In occupied Java, within the Dutch East Indies, the things were taken further by targeting white women for the first time. Although only about 300 Dutch women were forced into becoming comfort women, a small percentage of the total, their stories remained largely untold until recent years, sparking outrage in the Netherlands. In January 1942, Japanese forces launched amphibious assaults on Java, the administrative capital of the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese quickly overran the island, and on March 8, 1942, Dutch General Hein te Poorten formally surrendered, followed by the British surrender 2 days later. The Dutch East Indies archipelago was left to the mercy of the Japanese. Caucasian women and children were sexually assaulted in locations such as Tarakan, Manado, Bandung, Padang, and Flores Island. In Blora, near Semarang in Java, 20 European women and girls were confined in 2 houses along the main road. Over 3 weeks, as Japanese units passed by, these women and their daughters were subjected to repeated and brutal sexual assaults. Their protests were met with mockery by the Japanese officers, until a senior officer happened upon the scene and ordered the assaults to stop, relocating the women to the relative safety of an internment camp. The Blora rapes underscored the severe lack of discipline within the Japanese army and the sadism prevalent among many of its soldiers, who eagerly participated in these atrocities. The Japanese expanded their operations by staging additional landings on Timor, Sumatra, the Moluccas, and the Sunda Islands. After fierce battles with smaller Allied forces, they captured these territories. Dutch, British, and American soldiers were disarmed and sent to some of the harshest prisoner of war camps in Asia, where thousands succumbed to disease, starvation, physical abuse, and arbitrary executions. By the latter half of 1942, the Japanese also interned Allied civilians living in the Dutch East Indies, sending them to grim internment camps, where conditions were nearly as horrific as those endured by military prisoners, making these some of the worst civilian prisons ever operated by the Japanese. Java was at the center of this extensive internment system, due to its large pre-war European population. Approximately 150,000 Europeans were interned throughout the Dutch East Indies, either as prisoners of war or civilian internees, while another 22,000, mostly mixed-race Indo-Dutch individuals living on Java, were allowed to remain free outside the camps. However, even those who were not interned, including nationals of neutral or friendly countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Germany, and Italy, were not safe from the suspicions of the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, who viewed all non-Japanese as potential security threats. Possessing a Swiss or German passport did not necessarily protect one from the Kempeitais torture chambers or summary executions. Java was administered by the Japanese 16th Army, which was under the 7th Army headquarters in Singapore. The organization of military brothels was not centralized. Instead, local officers of the 16th Army ordered the field Kempeitai to establish comfort houses for the garrison. The commissariat officer of the 16th Army was instructed by the Chief of Staff to issue licenses to these brothels, but only if the women signed a document stating they were working voluntarily as providers of sexual services for the army. This was likely an attempt to avoid future prosecutions related to coercion, though the Kempeitai often used coercion and violence to obtain the necessary signatures, which were then sent to 16th Army headquarters in Batavia, now Jakarta. The women who ended up in these comfort houses came from various nationalities. Some were Japanese or Korean women who had been recruited and paid. Others were Indonesian women who were deceived into providing such services, and a smaller number were European women, either taken from internment camps or those who had remained free outside the camps due to their nationality. Initially, up until mid-1943, native and non-interned European women were mostly recruited as housekeepers for Japanese officers or civilians. When Japanese soldiers sought sexual services, they typically visited local brothels or engaged with individual European or native workers. Hotel owners were instructed by the Kempeitai to convert their establishments into brothels. By mid-1943, the Japanese sought to expand adult services by creating brothels organized by race or nationality. For example, some brothels were designated for Chinese women, while others were for Indonesians. Javanese women were brought in from outlying islands, and European women were increasingly targeted for recruitment from internment camps. Physical force was often employed by the Kempeitai to establish these brothels, which included locations in Batavia, Bandung, Pekalongan, Magelang, Semarang, and Bondowoso. This policy shift was likely driven by rising concerns over venereal diseases and the inability of privately run brothels to control the problem. Additionally, fewer European women were available for brothel work, as many preferred to form relationships as mistresses to individual Japanese men rather than work in brothels. The Kempeitai saw an opportunity in the internment camps around Semarang, believing that among the 20,000 women interned, enough could be coerced into becoming comfort women. The recruitment of European women as comfort women in Java is a complex and tragic story, falling into three general categories. The first group consisted of women who had been providing sexual services before the war and continued in this profession after the Japanese occupation. The second group included women who volunteered to leave the internment camps, lured by promises of work as barmaids or waitresses, only to be forced into providing sexual services by unscrupulous Japanese and Korean pimps. For example, in June 1943, the Japanese owner of the Akibono restaurant in Batavia was instructed by the Kempeitai to open a brothel called the Sakura, or Cherry Blossom Club. Of the 20 European women working there, 11 had volunteered to escape the Sedan internment camp in the city. The third and most tragic group consisted of European women who were forcibly taken from internment camps and used as slaves for sexual gratification by Japanese forces. Their stories are heart-wrenching. In November 1943, for instance, a recruitment drive was conducted by the Kempeitai at Muntalan internment camp near Magelang. A Japanese pimp and a local Kempeitai officer compiled a list of women they deemed suitable to become comfort women, further illustrating the horrific exploitation these women endured. They were brutally examined by doctors, sexually assaulted, beaten, and compelled to serve Japanese soldiers. One woman attempted to end her own life, another pretended to be insane and was placed in an asylum, while a third later had to abort her own pregnancy. The experience of one of these women was particularly horrific, highlighting the depraved and inhuman ordeals that decent Dutch women were forced to endure by the Kempeitai.
Serial penetration by many men is not a mild form of torture. It felt like fire applied to a cut. Your private parts swell and bruise. Damage to the womb and other internal organs can also be tremendous. Being used as a public dumping ground by those men left me with deep shame that I still feel in the pit of my stomach. It's like a hard, heavy, sick feeling that never entirely goes away. They saw not just my completely helpless naked body, but they heard me beg and cry. They reduced me to something low and disgusting that suffered miserably in front of them. Even years later, it has taken tremendous courage for me to put these words on the page, so deep is the cultural shame.
When they came in, you would already start standing up and bowing. Every evening it was another struggle when one of those Japanese men was inside. And if you didn't cooperate, well, in the end you didn't really have a choice, did you? You would get hit again, and then you had to comply. They had to do everything themselves, lift your dress or pull down your underwear. And I thought to myself, well, I'll just step out of myself for a few minutes. Because that's what it was, in and out. For such a man, there couldn't have been much pleasure in it either, right? That's how I can describe it. I always found them to stink, to be honest, those soldiers. Even the way they entered. As a woman, you felt disgusted. You had to go to bed with them, whether you wanted to or not. You had no say in it. Really, none. Because you didn't dare say yes or no, because if you did, they'd just beat you across the room.
Yan O'Hearn, a young girl born in Bandung, Java, in 1923, was among those who suffered. After the Japanese invasion, she, her mother, and her two sisters were imprisoned in a condemned army barracks at Ambarawa. O'Hearn recalled,
I had been in the camp for 2 years when the Japanese ordered all girls to line up in the compound. High-ranking military officers approached us, inspecting our bodies and legs, making it clear that a selection process was underway. The selected girls were then herded onto an open army truck and driven away as if they were cattle. I remember how terrified we were, clinging to our small suitcases and to each other. They were taken to a large colonial house located 25 miles from the camp, outside the town of Kelarang. When we arrived at the house, we were informed that we were there for the sexual pleasure of the Japanese military. Our world completely fell apart at that moment, and we immediately began to protest. We told them that we were forced into this, that they had no right to do this to us. We argued that it was against the Geneva Convention and that we would never comply, but they simply laughed at us. They said they could do whatever they wanted with us. Upon arrival, photographs of the girls were taken and displayed on the veranda so that Japanese soldiers could choose the one they preferred. The Kempeitai named the brothel the House of the Seven Seas. We were given flower names, which were pinned to our doors. As they began to drag us away one by one, I could hear the screams coming from the bedrooms, and all I could do was wait for my turn. When my turn finally came, a large, fat, bald Japanese officer stood in front of me, grinning. I fought him with all my strength, but he dragged me to the bedroom. Like the other girls, I was a virgin when I was assaulted. I told him, I'm not going to do this. But he responded by saying, I will kill you if you don't give yourself to me. And he actually drew his sword. I knelt down and prayed, feeling God's presence and no longer fearing death. However, the officer had no intention of killing me. He threw me onto the bed, tore off my clothes, and brutally assaulted me. I thought the horror would never end. The suffering was beyond anything I could have imagined. After he left, I wanted to go to the bathroom to wash away the shame and dirt. When I managed to get there, I found the other girls already inside, all in a terrible state. We were hysterical, crying, and desperately trying to wash away the dirt and the shame. In just one night, we had lost our youth. We were a pitiful group, clinging to each other, and I will never forget that first night. We felt utterly helpless, knowing that this would happen again, night after night.
The Kempeitai held these young girls at the House of the Seven Seas for 4 long months. They endured constant fear, a terror so intense it felt like an electric current running through their bodies, as described by O'Hearn. She recalled that this fear never left her. It has been with her throughout her life. At night, the darkness would trigger memories of repeated assaults, a fear that overwhelmed her and made her desperate to escape. O'Hearn reached a point where she felt she had exhausted all options. She even cut off all her hair, hoping that her altered appearance would make her less desirable, but instead, it turned her into a source of fascination, and they wanted her even more. The Kempe Tai had established the comfort stations partly to control venereal disease within the army, but their doctors, rather than offering sympathy, were as harsh and abusive as the other officers. When O'Hearn pleaded with one doctor to use his influence to report their situation, he responded by laughing and then assaulting her himself. From that point on, he would sexually assault her during each of his visits. Eventually, the Kempe Tai abruptly released the Dutch girls, sending them back to the Munterland camp to reunite with their families. They were warned not to speak about their experiences, or else their families would face repercussions. The release came in late April 1944, following an internal army investigation. A colonel from Tokyo, upon inspecting various camps, was informed by a camp leader about the situation. The colonel reported his findings, leading to the immediate closure of the brothels in Semarang. However, many of these brothels later resumed operations, but with mixed-race Eurasian girls instead of Europeans. Reuniting with their mothers was a moment of profound emotional strain. O'Hearn described how she couldn't speak to her mother initially and felt the trauma deeply, even as she was held in her mother's arms. The disclosure of their experiences was overwhelming for their families, who struggled to cope with the horrors their daughters had endured. The girls were only able to share their stories once, and it was never spoken of again due to its overwhelming nature. After the war, justice was partially served when the Kempe Tai major responsible for recruiting European women for the comfort stations was sentenced to death for war crimes. Other offenders faced prison, or in one case, suicide before trial. The Dutch women, including O'Hearn, attempted to rebuild their lives. O'Hearn married a British soldier and later moved to Australia. She, along with other survivors, became vocal in demanding an apology from the Japanese government. Recent research shows that of the 200 to 300 European women forced into this role in the Dutch East Indies, at least 65, like O'Hearn, were coerced by the Kempe Tai. O'Hearn expressed her frustration in 2007, angered by Japan's refusal to acknowledge their historical responsibilities despite ample evidence. This sentiment is shared by many victims of Japanese wartime aggression, and sadly, there remains no resolution or closure for these enduring tragedies from over 70 years ago.